Hello, thanks so much, David Mongeau, Executive Director of BIDS. It's been such a pleasure and joy to be collaborating with you. We're so happy that you joined this UC Berkeley community of data science and just general methodology. I am really excited today to talk about measuring hate speech in big data by unifying deep learning with item response theory. I'm going to be joined also in this talk by Chris Kennedy, as David was mentioning, a BIDS fellow as well as a D-Lab fellow, senior fellow. So the first thing that I want to do today is to say again, I'm the executive director of D-Lab. I also direct the digital humanities at UC Berkeley. I'm also the PI of this hate speech research project, and along with being continuing PI on several other projects, including the Digital Humanities Minor and Certificate Program and the SAGE Campus Online Learning and Data Science. So I want to start by thanking the rest of the research team, beginning with our lead author on the current manuscript, Chris Kennedy, a biostatistician who holds an MA in public policy, Jeff Bacon, a linguist, Nora Broge, a sociology PhD, and Alexander Son, a political scientist. We're also very excited to welcome our newest team member, Shamal Ozan Irmak, a PhD in neuroscience. And they're all going to be available during the Q&A segment to respond to your questions, although we do encourage your questions throughout the presentation. And as you can see, this research is deeply interdisciplinary and collaborative and breaks with a lot of normative structures in academia, and as such has evolved in an iterative and mixed methods research design manner that we feel can benefit others. So we're really excited to share our ongoing work, which is still formative at this stage. I also want to give a big thank you to the BIDS community and to David Mongeau specifically. We're deeply appreciative for the funding that BIDS has provided to us. It really has enabled us to do this work, and without it, we would not be able to do so. In addition to also funding Chris Kennedy, who's invaluable, a previous research team member, Chris Hench, was also a BIDS fellow. So we really feel that BIDS is a really central way that we're implementing data science on this campus, and the D-Lab and DEH community is really happy to be partnering with BIDS in multiple different ways. These different areas include diversity and inclusion and training, and so you'll see more joint efforts evolving together with BIDS and the D-Lab and digital humanities. I also want to say that we would not be able to do this work without the help and leadership of the Anti-Defamation League. Now more than ever, we feel that organizations like the ADL that fight against bigotry, discrimination, and violence motivated by hate, we need to lean on these organizations, and we need to make sure that these organizations are getting the kind of funding and support to do the kind of work that they do. And specifically, I want to thank them for the inception of this project, for being the biggest sponsor and really being instrumental in conceptualizing the project. They continue to be wonderful partners in the work. And specifically, Emmett Sultan, Associate Director of Research, Advocacy, and Technology Policy at the ADL Center for Technology and Society, is our direct contact and has been a great support and really a member of the larger team. Furthermore, I want to thank Citrus for their work in this area. They've been advancing knowledge in the area of hate speech and sexist speech for some time. We're really happy to have Brandy Nonek here today. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be collaborating with you, and we're really happy to be learning from your work and to be able to share our work with you. And the last group that I want to thank is Google Jigsaw. Google Jigsaw has been a really wonderful industry partner. The Perspective API has been a major part of the way that we've iterated in this project. They've also allocated funding to support our effort. So it's wonderful to have them both as a thought partner, but also as substantive support. So there's a lot of complexity in our work, and there's many different areas that we could go into great depth into. And in the next approximately 45 to 50 minutes, we will be exploring many facets of this interdisciplinary work that combines a multitude of different efforts. But there's two things that I really want to emphasize and that we will be coming back to time and again. And the two aspects of the work that we want to argue are really important are, one, that our mixed methods that combines both qualitative and quantitative phases is a much better fit for developing research that involves something as complex as hate speech and arguably other similar social and linguistic phenomena. I would just add to that that I'm happy to see our both social science and humanities, digital humanities partners here in the room. Ben Porter from the Hearst is a social scientist who deeply understands the humanities as well and has an incredible body of work that he offers as well. And it's this kind of interdisciplinary sharing that we feel is wonderful. And Nick Page is also here, and we're really appreciative for his involvement with the DH Advisory Board and the DH Council. So this interdisciplinary qualitative and quantitative phases in an iterative manner is one of the ways that we think we're advancing knowledge in the area of hate speech. And the second thing that we're going to come back to, and to put it really simply, is that we feel that we have found a better way to label data for machine learning purposes. And so we'll focus quite a bit on this aspect of the work. So the first thing that I'm going to cover is the motivation for this research. And so we ask, does hate speech actually matter? You hear many times people asserting that hate speech is increasing, hate speech is a serious problem, and making really kind of bold remarks about hate speech. The reality, the empirical reality, is that we don't know if hate speech is overall increasing or decreasing, because we haven't yet in the field developed measures to really systematically look at that question. And so we want to take a moment and pause and really try to think about whether this sort of is an alarmist view, or if in fact hate speech is increasing and if there's a causal link between hate speech and hate acts. But I will say that we certainly know that there's evidence of an increase of anti-Semitic assaults and hate acts. We know that there's been, thanks to the work of the ADL, anti-Semitic assaults have potentially doubled in the US. We know that violent anti-Semitic incidents rose also worldwide, 13%, according to one study. And we also do know that there's, if not only anecdotal, but some preliminary evidence that hate speech may be leading to much more egregious, and that there may be a causal link between hate speech and more egregious, horrific, even in the worst case scenario in our scale of incidents, such as the Charlottesville incident, where there's actually been deaths. And so we know that these linkages between hate acts and hate speech can be found, and that we're looking into Twitter, Spotify, and Discord to think through, and they themselves are taking responsibility about taking action against neo-Nazi groups after the Charlottesville event, as just one example, where white nationalists were allowed to exert violence on peaceful anti-hate protesters, and this is a commentary on my part, this last part, that seemingly unprotected by the police or other authorities. We also know that similarly in South Carolina, in a church shooting, Dylan Roof admitted that his motivation came from what he saw on the internet and what may have been a process of so-called radicalization or brainwashing. The Charleston church shooting was a mass shooting in which Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist, murdered 9 African Americans during a prayer service at a church. This happened in 2015, and 3 other victims survived the attack. And we also know that many women have been silenced through events such as Gamergates. Specifically in this instance, one of the targets was Zoe Quinn, who had received threats of rape and death threats, and was also doxxed, which is revealing her email address, her physical address, and with the specific purpose of encouraging acts of violence against her, to clearly silence her and marginalize her voice in this debate about sexism within the world of gaming. So it is for this reason that we are truly grateful for organizations like the ADL that have been combating this type of bigotry and really investing in thinking about the role of social media networks and how these social media networks are enacting and participating in this process. So briefly, there's also international examples that we can look to. And in fact, increasingly in the international context, because the legal frameworks are different, we're starting to see that there's sort of people taking Facebook in particular, but other platforms to account and holding them responsible in different ways. From Myanmar to Sri Lanka, there are many who are looking to see what the social media companies are doing and what their sense of culpability or responsibility is. Most recently in the New York Times opinion piece, there's also ideas of putting tariffs and taxes on these social media companies to really hold them accountable and to make sure that they have a responsibility in this process. So we have our own conspiracy theory regarding this hate speech process, and in this very elaborate graph that we're sharing here with you, we tried to summarize some of the major points. I see some people trickling in. There's seats in the front. Please come on up, my DSEP peeps. You're more than welcome to come to the front. So this summarizes in a nutshell a lot of the innovations that our research design holds. Really, this research seeks to improve society's understanding of hate speech, currently from sources such as YouTube, which about 70% of Americans use, Twitter, which is used by 20%, and Reddit, which is used by 10%. Ultimately, we want to understand its prevalence over time, variation across regions and demographics, and also we want to know how to influence it through future intervention. Through a combination of citizen science and machine learning, the team is developing a really nuanced measurement methodology that decomposes hate speech into various constituent components, enabling it to be transformed into a continuous hate speech scale, making it easier to rate, evaluate, and understand than a single omnibus question. So commonly, the most frequent way that people are identifying hate speech is by simply asking, is this hate speech, is this not hate speech, or something very similar to that. And so if you know anything about survey methodology, you know that there's many mistakes in that research design, and so we're going to unpack a lot of that. And so the innovations that this project is introducing is establishing a theoretically grounded definition of hate speech, inclusive of research, policy, and practice. Historically, this has been a major, major challenge. So it's a challenge in law, because in different countries and in different contexts, including within higher education and outside of higher education, there's different policies and different definitions of hate speech. There's also different definitions of hate speech on platforms and also in the research. David. Correct. So at this stage, and we're going to go into depth about that, at this stage we have collected data from all of these three sources. We've run preliminary analysis on a pilot set of data, and within the next few weeks we're going to be doing the full 50,000 labeled comments from these three different data sources, which is, to our knowledge, the first time that any research is going to actually be cross-platform in this kind of way. So Facebook is going to be in a next iteration, that's correct. Facebook is a very challenging, we recently applied for a hate speech grant using Facebook data, and I know Social Science One is also has a partnership with Facebook to try to open up. What they say is that the user agreements are very tight with Facebook, which may make sense because you're not anonymous on Facebook, so on Twitter you can be anonymous, and so having uniquely identifiable, as you know, information poses a secure data sharing issue there. But thank you for that question, and feel free to interject with questions throughout the presentation. So creating this robust definition across research, policy, and practice, and applying that definition to a multi-component labeling instrument, creating a crowdsourcing workflow at this time, but eventually a tool for crowdsourcing and labeling, and then also to curate an open and reliable multi-platform hate speech corpus. This is all going to be done and is being done through our GitHub repo and Jupyter notebooks. UV's in the crowd, we love Jupyter. And we're making sure that it's being held to the highest standard of replicable and reproducible research, which is also another challenge because a lot of the data sharing that we're asking for it at that level where everything will be available so that it could be replicated. And so ultimately we hope to create new knowledge through ethical online experimentation in citizen science and refine this AI models. And Chris Kennedy, in the second half of this talk, is going to go in much greater depth on the technical aspect of the machine learning models, as well as the item response theory, perhaps more importantly, the item response theory as it connects to deep learning. So theory and constituent construct development. So as I was saying earlier, really the crux of it is how we define it, how we define hate speech. And in order to define hate speech, we turn to Mark Wilson's work on psychometrics. And I think that this is part of our point here is that if we didn't have this interdisciplinary research team, we actually wouldn't have been grappling from the very beginning to say, okay, well, what tools and methods are at our disposal? Constructing measures, Mark Wilson is at the Graduate School of Education. It's a course that I took a really long time ago and that Chris Kennedy is currently taking valiantly, completely outside of his field. But that has really been at the center of the development of the item response theory and the instrument development that we've undertaken. So in terms of the theoretical background, again, we're confronted with a multifaceted problem that is thorny on all sides. Hate speech poses a real threat to the social fiber of our society. At the same time, freedom of speech must be preserved if we're to safeguard our participatory democracy. So political speech is particularly vulnerable to censorship, as we know from many national and international examples. I'm Bolivian, and I am here in the United States first as a political refugee because my father is a political novelist and journalist, and so we had to flee from Bolivia because of not having freedom of speech. So, I understand deeply the importance of freedom of speech, and honestly, we think that that is essential to safeguard, and it is made vulnerable by the discussion of hate speech, and so that's something we want to keep very mindful. As much as hate speech concerns us, we're equally concerned with repressive systems, particularly if they obfuscate from public view the practices, both government practices, but also different platform practices, And since we're an interdisciplinary team, we've been exploring these different facets from multiple perspectives. We started from a purely theoretical view, engaging with Judith Butler's excitable speech, and moved to more empirical work, such as Zeynep Tufekci's Twitter and Tear Gas, to think about the differential treatment of people on different platforms who are engaging in hate speech and counter speech. So for example, if you're on Facebook, you have to give your true identity, your name, and maybe you can go under the radar, but then you may be reported and eventually taken off of that platform. We know that many transgender people rely on pseudonyms so that they are kept safe and so that they can speak out against homophobia, transphobia, and other issues related to that. And so that's one example of, who's flagging these folks. What is their motivation? Is it to silence their speech? Is it because they're saying something that truly is egregious and truly is hate speech? These are some of the questions that Tufekci explores in Twitter and Tear Gas, and that's been incredibly helpful. And other platforms like Twitter, you can remain anonymous, but there's a similar issue of the way that things are flagged, how it plays out in the international environment and landscape. The Arab Spring is a really good example of how Twitter was used and misused, and potentially misused by governments. And so I think that that's something that we really need to attend to, especially in the United States, as many of these corporations are based in the United States. As Shamal recently wrote about in a blog on the DLab website, she asks, what is hate speech? And it seems like a simple enough question, but in fact, it's a very difficult social and linguistic phenomena to pin down. Susan Benesch has made a significant amount of headway in this area in her Dangerous Speech project, and has advanced knowledge specifically having to do with also vectors for counter speech on Twitter, as has Meredith Clark's work on Black Twitter and counter speech. So as we go into the scale that we're developing, you'll see that at the top of our scale, we have collective violence and genocide. And at the next level, we have violence. Then we have discrimination, and I'll talk in more detail, and then soon turn to Chris, and the individual acts of hostility. In one, we have negativity and bias, and then at the level 0, we have what we term not hate speech. We also have added 2 levels to our scale, which include positive identity speech and counter speech. So in this table, you'll see how this plays out. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but rather it's many different features and characteristics that define whether something is hate speech or not in our construct, that is in our conceptualization as a research team in conversation with other folks. We started from a grounded theory approach with a qualitative phase with a group of undergraduates from across the United States that were very diverse. And then we continued to interrogate this framework with a data set, a reference data set. Chris is going to present some of that work. So you can see that in terms of collective violence, this is the most extreme, or otherwise known as genocide, is the most extreme, where there's an identity, it's negative, there's insults and hostility, dehumanization, a call to violence, and that call is a collective call to violence. And so it goes down from there in terms of individual violence, discrimination and prejudice, bias, and then neutral identity speech. So I just want to add that our instrument has, it's basically comprised of 10 different items. We ask what the different identities are it presents a comment. It asks if there's an identity being targeted in that comment. It has to be one of the protected groups. And if they're in one of those protected groups, we go from the identity to sub-identity. And then we ask questions that correspond to that framework that I was just pointing to earlier. So I'm not going to go into much more detail here because Chris is going to really go through a lot of this, but I want to turn it over to Chris and say one last thing, which is what Chris is going to come back to and he's going to emphasize again is that, in fact, the most important thing, if you remember nothing else about this talk, is that we're doing two things. One is we're making sure that the people that label comments that are hate speech comments are actually, we are taking into account that the level of severity or leniency that they have in deciding whether something is hate or not hate, and somewhere in that spectrum. So, you know, what we like to do is give the example of graders, right? If you have a class and you have GSIs, and some GSIs are really hard graders, and some GSIs are, you can, you know, give everyone an A. And so you want to calibrate at some point, right? The people who are going to give everyone an A and the people who are going to give nobody an A, so that ultimately you do have a curve. And so you're preserving and getting a sense of like calibration across those different graders. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do with the item response theory. And Chris is going to go into greater detail. So that's one half. And then the other half is to actually decompose and deconstruct what hate speech is into different components rather than just a binary yes or no. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Claudia. And unfortunately, I have a bit of a cold, so I won't be quite as speaking quite as well as I otherwise might be. Let me just. Oh, how can we? Is there a way to make it bigger on this computer? Do you know? Is that? Okay, that's good. That's good for me. Okay, so before I get into the comment collection aspect, I wanted to just put in a couple notes on what our labeling instrument looks like. And so the overall goal of this project is to collect comments made on social media and then have moderators kind of go through our instrument and rate, does that comment have certain features that Claudia was showing on the reference set. And so that's why we call it a labeling instrument rather than a survey instrument. So we talked through some of the different items on that scale. There's the sentiment of the comment, which is really commonly used for machine learning. There's disrespect, humiliation, insult, slur, etc. And so for each of those questions on the survey, the reviewer will be given the option of kind of saying strongly agree to strongly disagree, or it might be customized a little bit for a given item. And then in addition to those core scale items, we also ask about the demographics of the rater so that we can understand patterns in the kind of observation of hate according to those raters. So we've talked about the reference set and the instrument, which is how we kind of operationalize all the theory. The next part is to do web scraping or API-based downloading to collect the different comments we want to be analyzing. So our main three sources for this project are YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit. On Reddit, we're kind of downloading them from this main subreddit that all the other kind of posts go to, called r/all. On Twitter, we're getting the most recent tweets as they come out. And on YouTube, we're searching geographically based on US cities. And the overall goal for each of these streaming methods is to really minimize the time lapse between when someone posts a comment and we're able to download it, because during that time period is when moderation can happen. And so if we were to wait a week to download Twitter comments, tweets, a lot of the hate speech would have been removed. So that's why we need to be very rapidly grabbing those comments, saving them, and then determining later on, was this hate speech, or to what extent was this hate speech? So that brings up kind of, once we get those comments, how can we efficiently label them given we have a limited budget? Because hate speech, even though it's really important to study and is very influential, it's not a high proportion of the average speech on the internet. It's only about 1% or less. So we don't want to be spending a lot of money to label 50,000 comments and only have 1% of those come back as being somewhere on our hate speech scale. That's not going to give us a lot of training data to apply the deep learning algorithms towards. So we're kind of trying to go beyond a binary conception of hate speech, but if it were just yes, no, what proportion would we want to have in our training data set in terms of percentage yes, percentage no? Anyone? You'd want to have 50-50, because that would give you the most power to determine these are the patterns we see in the positive in the hateful comments, and then these are the patterns we see in the non-hateful comments. So that 1% is not very close to the 50-50 split that's ideal from a power perspective. And in our case, we have potentially 6 levels or now even up to 8 levels of hate speech, and we'd really like to have a distribution as close to evenly as possible across the genocidal hate speech to the kind of violent but not genocidal hate speech, and then down to the counter speech. So we need to think really closely about how our sampling procedure can ensure we're labeling comments across that spectrum, but before we know, we haven't built the model yet, so we don't know if a comment comes in, where should it go in that spectrum. So we have to try to kind of have a hypothesis of where a comment might go without also adding bias into the data by only restricting the comments with slurs, for example. We want to be really agnostic to which comments we label so that we have a wide variety of kind of patterns in our data. The other aspect is across those platforms, Claudia talked about how YouTube is much more commonly used than Reddit, for example. 70% of Americans are on YouTube and only 5 to 10% are on Reddit. So we're also trying to allocate our labeling budget to best represent Americans' experiences with online content and not, focus all on Reddit, which would not be the most representative sample of how most people kind of experience hate speech, and Twitter is in between. And so thanks to Jeff Bacon's sampling work, we have collected over 15 million comments, and we have to figure out a procedure to kind of downsample that to the most efficient comments that we want to spend kind of a lot of money in our budget to have the raters go through. Yep. Yeah, I would say, among elites, among the news media, among people that are talking to each other, celebrities, Twitter is an important vehicle, but among the everyday population, most Americans don't use Twitter. So yeah, but a lot of natural language processing research and hate speech research focuses on either Twitter or Reddit more for convenience. But also, it's a little bit sexier than YouTube in some ways. But we wanted to be a little more cognizant of our platform selection strategy. Yep. Yeah, and so after we've downloaded those comments, we need to have a better sense of, does this comment seem like it could be very hateful, or does it seem like it might be counter speech? Does it mention any identity groups at all? If it mentions race or gender or religion, things like that, then that makes us think it could be worth labeling. If it doesn't mention any of those, we might want some portion to go into our sample, but we want it to be a small portion. And so that's where the augmentation of the comments comes in. We use Google's Perspective API, which has its own kind of hate speech model. That's kind of our initial hypothesis of where would it fall in terms of definitely hate speech or definitely not. But we don't want to rely on it to be accurate. So we're not setting a threshold at which we don't sample certain comments. We're just using it kind of to stratify our selection process. And then we can also use an identity group dictionary search to ask, does this comment include race or gender or religion? And we can use word embeddings, in particular Facebook's fast text embedding system, to automatically expand that dictionary to words that are similar in the word embedding vector space. So that gives us a more nuanced dictionary than the 50 terms we decide to initially put in the dictionary. just go through this part. So now we have kind of this really annotated set of comments and a sense of how likely are they to have hate speech. And we want to determine how can we package those comments into groups so that the raters, the reviewers, when they go on to Qualtrics and get that survey, that they rate a good variety of comments. And also we want to be able to estimate across those different labelers which ones are very receptive to hate speech that are kind of in some sense the easy graders, and which individuals are not very receptive to hate speech, and what many people might say, oh, it's definitely a violent threat for those people based on their education or their life experiences or other, causal things about how they read a comment. They might say that's not a violent threat. And so our batch creation process is really important to determine how we allocate the comments to the individual labelers and how they overlap across the labelers. So in our initial planning, we thought, let's have each comment be rated by 3 people. So we'll make groups of 10 comments and have 3 people rate those 10 comments. And then we're done with those, so let's go to the next set of 10 comments and collect our ratings that way. And this is, I would say, somewhat common in NLP kind of training data creation. The problem with this is that there's no linkage across the different batches. So these different raters don't rate, like raters 1, 2, and 3 don't rate any of the same comments as raters 4, 5, and 6. So as we're trying to create this fixed effect, essentially, of how receptive is the rater to hate speech, in this plan, we can't differentiate between if a given batch had more hateful comments or if the raters assigned to that set of 10 comments just happened to be more lenient and more receptive to seeing hate speech. And to date, no one has really ever calculated this fixed effect for the raters. You kind of just are hoping, I hope that they give the same results for the same comments, and if they don't, maybe I think something weird happened and I don't use that data. But we're kind of acknowledging up front, people have different life experiences, and we don't want to say you have to rate the same way as another person. We want to understand how that can be projected into a single dimension of their receptivity, and then adjust for that and keep going onward. So this is kind of our new approach, in which any given rater is rating a sequence of comments that overlaps with the raters that come before and after that person. And so if you look at the middle rater here, they're rating comments that are also rated by the previous 2 raters and the 2 after them. So when we're trying to estimate that rater's receptivity to hate speech, we can kind of calibrate it based on the interlocking network across all of the raters. And so that allows us to estimate a single fixed effect across every single rater and put them on the same scale. And not only through this top part, but also through having each rater also rate a sample from our reference set, where we're going to make sure that they get some counter speech, we're going to make sure they get some genocidal comments or 2, and something in the middle. So we got a really good spectrum for every single rater about how receptive they are to hate speech. And even if by random chance the comments they received didn't have hateful comments, we still know how they seem to be in terms of their reviewing process. So what does that look like? It looks like some sort of strange network plot here. If we look in the middle, these red dots, these are the raters, and they're in the middle because they're densely linked to each other through the overlapping comments as well as through the reference set. In the very center is the reference set that's being randomly sampled for every rater. So kind of through the reference set, it only takes a link or 2 to get to every other rater. So we don't have this disjoint subset problem where in the previous style we would have had 250 different networks that were not linked to each other at all. Now we have a single network, and on the outside these are the batches of comments that are each rated by 4 people. So they're not as densely linked to these inner people, but they are linked to each other through the raters and through the reference set. So it only takes, I think, up to 5 links for any single comment to be linked to another comment in here. And so this gives us the precision to estimate that fixed effect really accurately. So now we've kind of designed how we want people to review these comments, and now that goes into the Qualtrics system, and they're going to be given the comment at the top and asked different questions about that comment. So one additional innovation we had that hasn't been done before is to highlight slurs that are included in comments. And sometimes slurs are covert slurs that these hateful niche communities have created code words and coded language. And you don't want to rely on people to be experts on that language. They shouldn't have to know that. So if we take the time to identify those code words and just annotate them in their interface, we can kind of eliminate that discrepancy in terms of knowledge. And we don't have to define the term for them directly, or we're not trying to train them about what these slurs are, but they should be aware that a certain slur, a certain word is a slur, and then that can allow that their ratings are more accurate. So there will be a slur or two shown. So this is an example hateful comment in which, in this case, these would be well-known slurs, but if we had less well-known slurs, that would be even more important to allow the raters to easily kind of perceive those code words. But that's just what the interface looks like. So for this talk, we'll be going over our pilot results. And as Claudia said, we'll be ramping this up to 50,000 comments over the summer. Here we've got 1,000 original comments distributed across our 3 platforms, reviewed by 4 raters. And so for each labeler, they get 16 kind of random comments from the internet, but stratified across the Perspective API and the relevance lexicon. And then they also get 6 random comments from the reference set. So that gives us that dense network. And then now we're posting these jobs on Amazon Mechanical Turk and saying, will you go through this somewhat arduous task of rating these comments? And we have 246 of those batches labeled. And this is not inexpensive. Typically, Google and other major corporations might spend a cent or two per labeled comment. We're spending a lot more than that because we're going through a very intense labeling instrument across those scale items. We're restricting to United States workers because if that doesn't happen, other workers might translate the comment into their native language, fill out the scale, and then translate it back, and you lose a lot of meaning in that. So we're kind of going for a very high quality data set in this process. And it takes about 39 minutes to go through those 22 comments. Based in part on slacking with UV, we decided to go with a Google serverless function approach to hosting a kind of a server in which we have a Qualtrics survey set up, but it doesn't hold the comments in. It requests through a web service on Qualtrics, give me the next batch of comments. That web service is tracking which batches have been completed and which have been checked out. So this service will reserve a given batch for up to 10 hours, and once they complete that batch, that then goes back into the database saying that's done. If they never finish that batch after 10 hours, it'll go back into kind of the active pool. So that ensures we don't have to worry about missing data, we don't have to worry about drop-off, because if someone doesn't complete every comment in the survey, it'll go back to a new labeler. So with that, we labeled all of our comments through the item response theory, and now we want to use the scaling procedures of that to determine where does each comment fall on the hate scale. Is it very hateful, slightly hateful, unhateful? And then we want to look at the fixed effects for each raters. How do they align? Are they very receptive to hate speech? Or are they unreceptive? And the really important part of item response theory is that each of the scale items also goes on that hate speech scale. So we have the 10 survey questions. They each will be on that same spectrum of hate speech in terms of where they're most informative. So the genocide item will be the highest on the scale because if a comment is expressing genocidal thoughts, that's very indicative of a highly hateful comment. Whereas something that's disrespectful would be low on the hate scale because that might be hate speech or it might not. So we're still working on the visualization here, but on the left-hand side, you can see the distribution of our comments where the very top, these are the most hateful on this continuous spectrum. And then around here, these might be hostile messages, but they might not be hate speech. And then down here, these are definitely not hate speech. Then in the middle, this is how the item response theory statistics are able to convert each of the scale items to be on that scale. So genocide is at the top, as I mentioned. Humiliation, dehumanization are more in the middle. And then sentiment would be at the bottom because you could have positive sentiment that's hate speech or negative sentiment that's not hate speech. And then on the right, this kind of hodgepodge of numbers is the labeler, is the rater ID or the labeler ID. And that shows, this is basically showing there's definitely a distribution on receptivity to hate speech. And we're the first project that has estimated this for hate speech and said, we're not just going to look at reliability across the raters. We will estimate where do they fall on this scale, and we can subtract that from our estimate of the comments hatefulness. This rater at the top was the most kind of hostile or least receptive to hate speech. And in their comment, they suggested, their feedback on the survey, they suggested slurs were helpful and that we should just be honest and basically be as hateful as possible. So that made us think that fixed effect seems pretty accurate for that person. Whereas this person here was the most receptive to hate speech. And so they would kind of be more the easier grader where they say like, oh, I pushed my brother, and then they would rate like, oh, that's a threat of violence or something, I don't know. So the point of the raters part is that we really want to be estimating that as we're building machine learning training data sets, especially in NLP, and not allowing this hate speech scale on the comment side to be influenced by this, or eliminate as much of the influence as we can. We can also look at the scaling results for our reference set. And in this case, we had a six level reference set. So we see here, these are the positive identity comments that we theorize would be low on the scale. These are the non-hate speech comments that may or may not have even had an identity group. And then on the right here, these would be the genocidal comments. Actually, 3 and 4 were both genocidal in this version. So this is good confirmation that we theorized about where the comments on a reference set should go. Now we've checked empirically, does that align? And then based on these results, we are kind of revising that again in a cyclical fashion. So we're going to think about the comments that don't fit as well. Do we need to review how they fit with our items and maybe change which level they represent? Conquest is the IRT software we're using. And if we look at this middle number here, it's showing we have about a 0.7 reliability. So that's a very, I would say, pretty standard amount of reliability, but we're hoping to iterate on our instrument and our design to get that up a little higher. This next slide is showing how well are we estimating the fixed effects for those raters, or how receptive they are to hate speech. And this is showing, based on that really dense network of linkages across all the raters, we're very accurately estimating where each of those raters falls in terms of how they view hate speech. And the statistical test is saying the null hypothesis is that there's no difference across raters. And that's actually what everyone assumes when they're doing these training data sets. They're like, we'll get 4 or 5 or 6 people to rate it, and as long as they mostly agree, we'll just use the results. This is showing there's highly significant differences across those fixed effects. So that's confirmation that we need to be doing this more as a routine procedure. Okay, so that was the IRT side. We've got this scale. We were able to convert how labelers fill out the items into this continuous variable on hate speech. Now we need to do it at a big data level. So we can't ask graders to label millions of comments that are being posted every day. We need to automate that with machine learning. So the overall problem is, can we kind of calibrate or configure our machine learning algorithms to learn the patterns of hate speech in a sufficiently accurate manner that we could track hate speech over time without some sort of manual sampling. And that would allow us to then look at interventions and causal effects and all the later science we want to do once we have this measure. That being said, this automation process is relying on our scale being a well-developed scale, the theory being strong, and it's kind of pulling a rabbit out of a hat where we're the ones putting that theoretical rabbit in the hat. So we can't just kind of throw algorithms at the data. We had to really carefully curate that training data set. And ideally, we would achieve close to human performance, if not better. Okay. So the standard approach to machine learning for hate speech would be the binary outcome. So is it hate speech, yes or no? So someone makes a comment on Twitter, and it goes into this AI model, and maybe the research team or Facebook or Twitter, or perhaps it's a legal case, asks the algorithm, is that hate speech? And the algorithm says, that's 37% hate speech. And that's what we do right now. And the way that's done is that the raw comment text goes into some sort of deep learning-based NLP system where BERT, ULMFit, or GPT are the most commonly used algorithms. And those algorithms have been kind of initially trained by reading about like 10,000 books and all of Wikipedia. So they have a good sense of how language patterns happen. Then this next part here is translating, or combining those language patterns in the raw comment text into latent variables that allow it to essentially create really complicated interaction terms that then eventually get collapsed to a probability here for how certain do I feel like this is hate speech or it's not hate speech. Because of the item response theory approach that we've been developing, we actually have a huge shortcut in the deep learning architecture that's never been done before. And so instead of, we have a continuous hate score now, so for one it's more granular, but we don't have to have the deep learning predict that hate score. It can only learn how to predict our items themselves. So for each of the comment texts, we have the 4 responses on the survey that those comments received from the labelers. So were there identity group targets, what's the sentiment, the respect and humiliation items, dehumanization. Each of those survey items is essentially a categorical outcome. So we can do kind of a softmax prediction where for each of those outcomes we predict what's the probability of strongly agree, what's the probability of neutral, what's the probability of disagree. And because we have so much data on that, this fully connected section here can learn to kind of predict each of those survey items, and those are much simpler tasks to predict. It doesn't have to look at 2 sentences on Reddit and say, how hateful is this comment? We're only asking it, what's the sentiment of this comment? What's the violence level? Those it can understand with less effort and with less variability than this super complicated hate speech construct that we just spent like 30 minutes trying to explain. So on the training side, this is essentially a multitask deep learning problem where we're sharing the weights within this layer to understand language and essentially train an AI algorithm to fill out that Qualtrics survey just like we asked the Mechanical Turk workers to do. It doesn't have to have any sense that we're trying to predict hate speech, and we don't tell it that. And the Mechanical Turk workers also, we never told, we're asking these questions because we theorize they can be translated into a hate speech scale. In the same way, the deep learning algorithm only has the labeled outcomes for this part. But through the scaling calibration of the IRT model, we can then translate those probabilities for each of those scale items into the continuous hate speech score and have a confidence interval on that score as well. Oh yeah, and then the last aspect of this is that if we look at the label data for the outcomes and we just kind of feed it into the algorithm, we're not yet correcting for which labelers were more severe, or which ones were more receptive to hate speech. We want to include that so that it doesn't influence how the algorithm analyzes the text itself. So what we can do is pass in the estimated rate or severity or receptivity into this intermediate set of layers. Then it can adjust its understanding of the text here and say, oh, this is a very severe rater. I initially thought, there wasn't, that it was very physically violent, but because of that rater, I'm going to reduce my probability estimate there. And that'll allow it to get closer to what it sees in terms of the label data without changing how it interprets the comment text. Okay, well, I think we're almost done here. So how does this look like kind of updating that previous chat scenario? So someone makes a comment on Twitter, it goes into the AI model. Someone asks the AI, where do you place that comment on your hate speech scale? So now it's not just a binary question, it's thinking about, is it genocidal, is it counter speech? Where does it fall in this much more nuanced spectrum of hate speech? Now, because the model had that multitask architecture, it has a very fine-grained understanding of the comment. It says, well, it looks like it has negative sentiment based on all the other training data I've seen, and I feel pretty certain about that. I'm very certain that it's a violent threat. It definitely has an identity group target, and it looks to be humiliating. So then based on aggregating that with the IRT parameters, it then can automatically convert it into the hate speech score. So it would be 2.5 plus or minus 0.03. So, and the reason that works is that looking at this simple part here, these latent variables that the deep learning needs to understand, it's just kind of randomly initializing them and trying to update them in an arbitrary fashion to learn this latent representation of hate speech. But it's going to need a ton of data for that. In our case, because of the IRT scale, we've told it how to represent hate speech on its own. It doesn't have to learn how to represent hate speech. It only needs to learn how to represent the components of hate speech. So that's going to be far more sample efficient. It's a kind of a completely new methodology for analyzing complicated social phenomenon or any sort of outcome in which multiple components could be aggregated to a final outcome. And then it also can be calibrated for differences in perceived kind of analysis of that instrument. Okay, so last slide. Let's just summarize some of the technical aspects. No one's really applied item response theory to an NLP problem before, and so we hope we can motivate others to consider this. And because of that IRT kind of deconstruction of hate speech into the scale, it really kind of directly maps into multitask learning and deep learning, which hasn't been done before either. But for the language modeling side, we're starting to get a lot more into multitask learning, so it's kind of in the air. And by having those individual items, they're a shortcut to teaching the algorithm to understand the components of hate speech. We also get a much more fine-grained estimate of hate speech, not just what's the probability that it is hate speech. We have the fixed effects estimation that we adjust for, which has never been done. And all of this will lead to more accurate, more granular models that require less data and are less prone to human biases as well, which is something we all want to be working on. So we think by really deploying this at scale, this should take us somewhere closer to reaching human level performance at measuring hate speech and potentially even exceeding it in the future. But all that said, we're relying on the qualitative, the theory development, all of the work on the reference set. It's not just throwing deep learning at a problem and running away and getting funding, but that does sound good too. So we want to reiterate the cyclical nature of the project where we're theorizing, we're having hypotheses, we're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall. We want to hypothesize and confirm or reject those hypotheses, apply data to our theories, and then loop back around and continue getting better and better. So with that, I think, Claudia, do you want to give any final notes or we could take questions?